Opponents ready?
Yes.
Judges ready? Beginning my time now, I'd like to thank everybody in this room for making this debate possible. I'd also like to congratulate our opponents for making it to the quarterfinals at the state's tournament. I'm going to be going over the framework of the debate first, then I'll be going over the actual argumentation the AF has provided here today. Resolved that punishment by its very nature should be somewhat cruel and unusual. Obviously, there's a value appended to this, and then for us, the affirmative is going to add the value of justice. Since this is obviously a value debate about who upholds justice the best, who upholds the criminal justice system the best, whoever upholds justice should win today's debate. Furthermore, we define punishment as the authoritative imposition of something undesirable or unpleasant upon an individual or group in response to criminal activity. We also define cruel and unusual as defined by Justin William Brennan by 4 principles in Furman v. Georgia. 1, the essential predicate is that a punishment must not be, by severity, be degrading to human dignity. 2, severe punishment that is obviously inflicted in a wholly arbitrary fashion. 3, severe punishment that is clearly and totally rejected throughout society. 4, severe punishment that is patently unnecessary. Favor this interpretation because cruel and unusual is a constitutional idea, and the Supreme Court of the United States interprets the Constitution of the United States. Brennan notes that if it even fails one of these principles, a certain punishment, then it is cruel and unusual. Observation 1. The affirmative only needs to prove one of the 4 above points. This is a debate about punishment being somewhat cruel and unusual, not completely cruel and unusual. Observation 2. The affirmative is by no means bound to the fact that cruel and unusual punishment is good. All we have to say is that we should have cruel and unusual punishment, and I'll be explaining this a little bit more later. Any questions?
Can you please explain the separate 4 points one more time?
The separate 4 points. 1, basically it can't be degrading to human dignity. 2, it can't be arbitrary. 3, it can't be rejected throughout society. 4, it can't be unnecessary. Cool? Any other questions? No. Our first contention is going to be about human dignity. By definition, all punishment is degrading. The definition of something degrading and the definition of punishment are synonymous. It's something that violates your own autonomy. It's something that makes you less of a human being, and every single punishment issued by an authoritative power like the government of the United States or like the Californian government degrades your personal autonomy. You don't want to go to jail, but the United States government forces its will upon you and makes you go to jail. That means all punishment by definition will always violate your autonomy. This is important for a couple of reasons. It means that right now in the status quo, every single punishment we have, whether it be a fine, whether it be being sent to jail, or whether it even be capital punishment, will always degrade human dignity, and there is no other circumstance that it won't degrade human dignity. Our second contention is about arbitrarity. In criminal cases, people who committed the same crime under similar circumstances can get very different punishments. This is for a number of reasons, but in the aforementioned Furman v. Georgia case, Justices Stewart, White, and Douglas noted that death sentences were often imposed arbitrarily with a distinct bias against African American people. If you're tried for the same case but one man is African American and the other man is Caucasian, there is a significantly higher chance that the African American man will be sentenced to capital punishment. This by definition is arbitrary. Race is not an issue that should come into any court ruling, but it does, which means that punishment, no matter what court of law you look to, will be cruel and unusual because it's arbitrary. The trend continues throughout the rest of the judicial system, as no matter what the crime is, minorities and racial ethnicities that are of a minor group are always going to be more harshly sentenced than whites, suggesting a non-objective application of the law. Yeah.
How is this essential racism solved by cruel and unusual punishment?
The argument we're making is that cruel and unusual punishment causes racism, and I'll be clarifying that in our third contention, the solvency. If you do value the actual inherency, the inherent autonomy of all human beings, if you do think that racism is bad, then cruel and unusual punishment should be created for a couple of reasons. 1, remember the last 2 things that Justice Brennan talks about is that if it's cruel and unusual, it's obviously going to be rejected throughout society. If it's cruel and unusual, it will obviously be viewed as unnecessary. This is the fundamental point. If all punishment is viewed as cruel and unusual, then the United States and American people, by definition, abandon the idea of cruel and unusual punishment. Since the definition of cruel and unusual punishment is that it's rejected by the American people, making all punishment, by definition, be somewhat cruel and unusual means that the United States' entire civilian populace, as a group, will abandon cruel and unusual punishment. So what's the alternative when somebody commits a crime? The third contention is about rehabilitation. Rehabilitation right now is making a very steady rise in the United States. And many studies done by Princeton University and done by Harvard University find that when you look into jails, criminals that are treated with respect, criminals that are treated as functioning parts of human society, they're the ones that can actually come back to society and contribute. But if you simply punish them, if you give them 20 years of jail, it makes them resentful, not more willing to help the society that they're part of. Therefore, we think that subpoint A, the idea that rehabilitation is good, means that we should have every single form of punishment be cruel and unusual, because once the American people reject cruel and unusual punishment, we favor rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is furthermore because subpoint B, it creates a better functioning United States of America. Today, hundreds of thousands of people are incarcerated for very arbitrary crimes every single day. Merely the possession of marijuana, according to the minimum punishment philosophy located in the legal system, could get you up to life in prison, even if you only possess marijuana and don't actually consume it, don't actually sell it, don't try to hurt other people. This represents a fundamental injustice and a bias that's created within the justice system, because the punishment is never proportional to the crime. Punishment is always going to be cruel and unusual. A favoring towards rehabilitation means that people can be treated with the dignity that by definition punishment can't provide. This means that in the United States of America, the citizens of the United States can be treated as real human beings, and being a criminal, making one mistake in your life, does not label you as a subclass human for the rest of your life. Making one mistake in your life means you can learn from your mistakes. It means you can look to rehabilitation, which is by definition not cruel and unusual because it treats you as a real human being. Doing that means that as the United States of America, we can finally create a real country where people can come back to society, they can help everybody around them, they can contribute back to the economy, and that's the most important terminal impact. When we look at the value of justice, justice is treating other people fairly. Justice is viewing another person as equal to yourselves, and the upholding of rehabilitation decreases dehumanization. Dehumanization is the idea that you look at another person as lesser than yourselves. If somebody possesses some marijuana, the criminal justice system immediately looks upon that person as lesser. If the other person is African American, the criminal justice system immediately looks upon that person as lesser. The second you view somebody as a lesser human being than yourself, you justify violence against them in order to benefit yourself. That's what we're trying to avoid. We want to create an equal society where every single person's opinion, no matter what skin color they are, no matter what things they've done in the past, is now valued for its own worth and not for past history. For these reasons, we firmly believe that all punishment should be cruel and unusual, and therefore unconstitutional, with rehabilitation as the firm alternative. For these reasons, I urge for a firm vote in the affirmative. Thank you.
Judges ready? Opponents ready? Begin my speech now. So we look at today's topic, that value resolved. Punishment by its very nature should be cruel and unusual. We would like to specify a topicality in today's debate where we look at today's value. Today's value defined by the government team was justice. They wanted the value in today's debate to be the justice availability to individual constituents within the United States. But this is the violation. The value today should not be justice simply because it's not broad enough. It doesn't encompass the entire system in the United States, which is punishment, or in the entire world. We're taking into account throughout the entire world how societal welfare, this is the counter-interpretation, societal welfare for every single individual throughout the world should be valued in today's debate, not just the justice system. We're seeing that when we're valuing cruel and unusual punishment that directly affects humans throughout the world itself, the best way to value this round is with societal welfare overall in the global spectrum. In addition to this, the standard is going to be grounds, because it gives everybody here equal ground, because the justice system affects everybody, not just those punished, but those families, as well as the victims included, which means that everybody's affected by a crime, not just the justice system. This is a voter issue because it expands education in the round overall, but also because of this, we realize that it allows us to truly debate what matters most, which is societal welfare for the entire world. Now, this is an a priori issue, and I'll move on to the opposite government team's case. The first contention talks about dignity. Actually, you can sum up the entire government team's case in one simple sentence. They think everything is cruel and unusual. Basically, if you look at the entirety of their case, they completely ignore today's question, whether cruel and unusual punishment should be cruel and unusual overall by its very nature. And in essence, we're going to observe that in today's society, in the United States, and overall in the world as a whole by the United Nations, we shouldn't have cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, so looking for the first contention, which is dignity. They talk about all punishment being degrading. Now, they fail to understand what punishment really is. Punishment is a penalty for committing a crime. Now, this is not demeaning in its own right. What a punishment is retribution for an individual. For committing a crime, you have retribution for this fact. What cruel and unusual punishment is doing something above the norm. We're going to examine how the United States Bill of Rights specifically has an article talking about cruel and unusual punishment being banned in the domestic United States. The reasoning behind this is that cruel and unusual punishment should be allowed because it hurts the criminal processes and jurisdiction of every individual within our nation itself. But before moving on, I'm going to answer the first question.
Can you give an example of any specific type of punishment that isn't degrading, or like any type of retribution that isn't degrading to human dignity?
Yes, one example is paying a fine for having a speeding ticket. And this is one example. If you speed on the road, you're going to get a speeding ticket because you have broken the law. This isn't demeaning. In fact, what's basically happening is you're paying retribution for a law you broke. This isn't demeaning and not degrading your human status. They talk about the four specific principles of cruel and unusual punishment. One is that it can't be degrading to human life. And this is not degrading to human life. This isn't even affecting human life in the long term. What it's doing is simply taking money out of your pocket because of a crime that you committed in the past. Now, looking at the second contention, we're looking at arbitrary laws. Now, they talk about African Americans and how in many states, or in this one primary example, African Americans have a higher incarceration rate for capital punishment than other races such as Caucasians or other Asian Americans. And the simple response to this is that this is not a good thing. They're advocating that they want racism in the round or overall in the bigger picture. They say in the resolution themselves as a government team that punishment by its very nature should be somewhat cruel and unusual. Should be. They want this situation to occur. They want the situation to occur where cruel and unusual punishment, or preferring African Americans to be tried by capital punishment in the status quo, to be the standard across the world. This is something you're not going to vote for the government team for, but instead, this is why you should vote for the opposition team. Not only do we decrease racism in the round, but we decrease the amount of individuals tried through capital punishment. Now, I'm sorry, I'm allowed to get through. I'll try to get a question at the end of time. But more, we're going to look at how the third contention of the government team talks about rehabilitation. This is not cruel and unusual punishment. This does not break any of the four principles that they lined out. This is not arbitrary because rehabilitation is because of a crime. In addition to this, it's not unnecessary and too extreme because rehabilitation is the least you can do. You're not punishing them by incarcerating them. This is helping them get back on their feet, giving them a second chance. This is not degrading because it's showing that we respect them as humans, that we want to reintegrate them into society. And they're not being rejected by society because they're being welcomed back, because after rehabilitation, you're welcomed back into society as a human being. So in fact, rehabilitation is something you vote for the opposition team for. And more than that, the fourth example they brought up was about marijuana possession and how life in prison can be good for marijuana possession. But the problem is they ignore why individuals spend life in prison for marijuana possession. These specific examples are for individuals who have been caught dealing drugs. And for example, these individuals who are caught with the marijuana in their possession are in such massive quantities that beyond a reasonable doubt, the United States Supreme Court system has declared that these individuals are very likely to be drug dealers of marijuana or cannabis. And as a result, this is one voting issue for today's debate. I'm sorry, I have a lot to get to. I'll try to get a question at the end of time. But looking on to the opposition team's case, we're going to look at the first contentions, actually rehabilitation. Cruel and unusual punishment that does not fit the crime, is basically a simple way to define their entire case or their entire definition. Rehabilitation, the purpose of punishment is for reforming an individual. If the punishment fits the crime, it's not cruel and unusual. It's something needed for human society to work. In addition to this, we observe how Lancet University reports that rehabilitation is 71% effective in reducing recidivism, which basically means doing the same crime twice, which means if you don't punish them cruel and unusually, and you go through the path to rehabilitation, what you're doing is fixing the problem, which is their mindsets, making them go towards peace and go towards normalcy. In addition, this is going to make society better. The impact is you make society better, decrease deaths, decrease crime overall, and decrease dehumanization across the United States and across the world. The second contention talks about deterrence and how this actually doesn't help deterrence. With cruel and unusual punishment actually increases crime. We're going to observe that the cruel and unusual punishment death penalty, Texas in 1989 actually had an increase of 23% more homicides in the 5 years after the death penalty was reinstated. North Dakota in 1976 had 35% more homicides in the next 5 years, according to the CIA World Factbook. Basically saying that deterrence, cruel and unusual punishment, one example, the death penalty, taking away someone's life, is going to hurt. The last contention talks about Guantanamo Bay and how Guantanamo Bay was a horrible example of cruel and unusual punishment. There was waterboarding, torture, cruel and unusual punishment. They were no longer called humans. They didn't have names. They had numbers, similar to Nazi Germany. And terrorism increased directly because of this as a result. And as a result, I strongly urge a vote for the government opposition team. Thank you. Sorry.
Judge ready? Opponents ready?
Yes.
Cool. So, beginning my time now, I'd just like to give a brief thanks to everybody for making this debate possible. To give a brief roadmap, we'll be going first, we'll be going over topicality. Then after that, I'll go on to our case. Then after that, I'll go into their case. Cool. So now let's move on to topicality. They say that the is interpretation where they said that it should not be justice, but rather the value should be societal welfare. And then they said that we violate this by making it justice. The standards for this, they said, were breadth and then ground. However, we can see that actually we should be preferring depth as a standard for today's round, because basically when you have depth, that means you're able to dive into an issue and actually understand like why everything is important. Whereas when you only have breadth, that's the type of education you could get simply from watching like, Fox News or MSNBC. It's only through debate where we can critically analyze points and then bounce them off of each other, where we can get depth of education. So that's why you should be prioritizing debate as in this particular activity as a nice forum for where we can actually go into depth. This is the only place where we can actually get depth of education. So therefore, you should be preferring the standard of depth when evaluating this topic, topicality show. Then let's look at the issue of ground. They said that basically their definition provides more ground. They actually never tell you why our standard of justice actually harms ground. Other than so basically we can see that our interpretation still provides ground. And also looks at the standard of creativity. They said basically that we don't have enough breadth, we don't allow for enough arguments. However, this actually promotes more creativity because we are actually talking about how justice affects the world. We have to make creative arguments understanding that. So therefore, we can actually see that we are going to be more have a better education from this, because creativity is the internal link to education. By having more creative arguments and coming up with arguments off the top of off your cuff, that means you're going to be getting more education, because you can just have pre-prepared blocks or pre-prepared arguments that you would be relying on. Then, since they didn't have a way to evaluate topicality, we believe they should be evaluated under the framework of reasonability, which means that basically they have to win every single standard brought up in today's round. Because if our definition is better in some way, shape, or form, that means it is a reasonable definition. So if you believe our definition is reasonable in some way, shape, or form, then you shouldn't be evaluating this basically topicality shell whatsoever. So our counter interpretation is that justice should be preferred here, because this is an issue of justice. So therefore, you should be looking at the field literature in today's case, because when we're talking about whether or not something is cruel or unusual, we're looking at the justice system that we find in today's round. So therefore, we shouldn't be looking to societal welfare, because when you're evaluating the justice system, you should be looking to issues of justice rather than simply how it affects societal welfare. Because justices are not instructed to look at basically how they affect people, but rather the rule of the law. So therefore, justice is going to be the value criterion for today's round. But now, with that underway, let's go on to our case. Cool. So let's look at our framework. Basically, you can see the rest of our framework. So we'll be looking at our framework for today's round, where I said that the affirmative is not need to prove that cruel and unusual punishment is a good idea, just that it should exist, which means that cruel and unusual punishment leads to rehabilitation occurring. That means we'll be winning today's round. When my opponents concede our observation, that means we'll be using that as a framework for evaluating today's round. So now let's look at our first contention. Now we basically talked about how basically all punishment violates human dignity and is essentially dehumanization. Sure. So basically, they conceded the fact that basically this is entirely dehumanizing, because of the fact that when you have this fine, when you have this any sort of punishment, that means that it forces you to give up something that you would rather do, because it compels you to do something that you otherwise would not have done. For example, they decided to say that the fine is not a form of punishment which does not violate human dignity, but we see that it can, because it forces you to give up your own wealth, which is something that you do, in a case where you did not want to do so. Yeah.
Is the public education system also taking away your dignity because you're forced to go there until you're 18?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Yeah. I agree. It is dehumanizing. Taxes are dehumanizing. Then let's look at the fact that they decided to say basically that we fail to understand punishment. However, we do understand how punishment works. We are telling you that all punishment is by definition degrading, because it is something undesirable or unpleasant that is being inflicted on a person against their will. It is so therefore we can see that retribution is inherently dehumanizing, because of the fact that it takes away your own individual rights and self-autonomy. They can see the fact that all punishments violate autonomy, and at the point where they violate autonomy, that strips you of human dignity when you look to our first part of our framework. Then let's look to basically that our second contention, where we decided to talk about how it's arbitrary. They basically said that this is not a good thing. However, we agree that being arbitrary is not a good thing. However, we say that it is this should be cruel and unusual punishment. Everything should be cruel and unusual punishment, because it collapses the current retribution system. You see, when you see how horrible the current retribution system is, my opponents make the same argument that it is a horrible system. That means that when we see how horrible it is, and we say that all punishment is cruel and unusual, that means that the current retribution system has to collapse, because that means that all punishment is against the Constitution, which means we cannot punish people anymore. Yeah.
So every single law in the United States that prevents you from doing something is taking away your dignity because it takes away your free will?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay.
Cool. So that means that basically when we see this happen, we can see that when they collapse the current retribution system, we prevent dehumanization. My opponents in their own speech say that basically rehabilitation is good, the death penalty increases crime, that Guantanamo Bay was dehumanizing, and they basically say that dehumanization is the most important impact. At the point where they say that dehumanization is the most important impact in today's round, they'll be disregarding everything else they say in today's round because they cause a current dehumanizing system to exist. Guantanamo Bay exists in the status quo where it currently does not violate the Constitution, where it is not deemed as cruel or unusual punishment. So basically, we can see that this is going to be a major issue. So we can see that basically everything should be focused on rehabilitation, solving for all these problems. Now here's why we gain access to rehabilitation and they don't. Because we see that an organic backlash will occur against this as a result of people seeing how cruel and unusual the entire punishment system is. They can see the fact that all the things that we said were bad. They can see the fact that arbitrariness is bad. They can see the fact that basically stripping these people of their rights is bad. So therefore we can see that this is indeed cruel and unusual. So at the point where you understand that every single punishment is cruel and unusual, understand that every single punishment is unconstitutional, that means that the only option therefore is rehabilitation. Now we come to the fundamental agreement that rehabilitation is good. So therefore we can see that since we're the only one that cause rehabilitation to occur within the current system, that means that we will be winning today's round because my opponents never gain access to rehabilitation. Because in the current status quo where we do not believe that every single punishment is cruel and unusual and is unconstitutional, we do not gain access to rehab because the justice system, generally speaking, prefers to have retribution occur. So therefore we can see my opponents actually cause the death penalty to occur. They cause Guantanamo Bay to occur. They don't prevent this. They actually lead to more dehumanization. So therefore we can see that problem occurs with their case. That means that we prevent dehumanization, which means that we prevent the root cause of all violence. Because when you view a single human as less than you, that means that you are justified in doing anything, doing any and all atrocities against them in order to benefit yourself, which means that dehumanization will be coming first in today's round. Then there's basically said to say in response to our contention that people who deal drugs deal these drugs should be put away. However, why should they be put away? Why is dealing drugs wrong? They shouldn't have their dignity stripped for just because they committed because of the fact that they were dealing marijuana. They never actually are justifying this, and also the fact that this justifies dehumanization. This justifies their rights being stripped simply because we disagree with what they do. At the point where we are taking away their rights because we disagree with what they do because they violate our own moral code, that means that we are basically, as a result of this, causing more violence as a result of this because they cause dehumanization to occur. So in conclusion, when you look at today's round, you'll see that we actually collapse the entire system retribution because we make it illegal for this punishment to occur, and then for the only option is rehab, which we both fundamentally agree to be good. Therefore, I strongly urge you to vote in the affirmation. Thank you.
Okay. Opponents ready?
Yeah.
Partner ready? Judges ready? All right, let's begin. In the course of today's debate, we realize that cruel and unusual punishment is similar to that of an anglerfish. Although the government team dwindles and dangles the dim benefits in front of it, if we allow cruel and unusual punishments, we're going to be dinner. Which is why I stand in the strongest negation of today's resolution. Now, first and foremost, I'll be addressing their case, showing how essentially their case is rather inconclusive, and then going into our own. Now, first and foremost, the biggest and probably most debated and heatedly talked about issue is that of the topicality argument. Now, I won't go into all the technicalities that the previous speakers aforementioned. I'll just put this very simply to you. Why do we need justice? We need justice because it will ultimately help our world. It will ultimately bring us societal welfare, and it will ultimately give us net benefits. This is why, because justice leads to net benefits, why we should be valuing the end result, the end goal of net benefits. Net benefits is essentially the ultimate goal, the biggest ground, and essentially the major reason that both sides are advocating for. And this is why we win this topicality issue. Sorry, I actually have a lot to get through in this whole speech, so yeah. With this in mind, let's now move into the case. Their first contention talked about human dignity. Essentially, when my partner asked the question of what is essentially a punishment that doesn't violate human dignity, they claimed none. They stated that every single punishment within the United States violates human dignity. Every single punishment is cruel and unusual. Evidently, that is simply absurd within the United States law system. What they're advocating for then is simply no punishment at all. Essentially no laws, no crimes, and essentially nothing. A system without education, without taxes, because they all are cruel and unusual, they all violate human dignity. What we essentially have is total anarchy in the end, which essentially violates their definition of justice and our definition of net benefits, because anarchy is one of the most disordered state and essentially has no form of communication. Again, I have a lot to get through, so Yeah. Now with this, we can see that anarchy is the biggest point because we refuted their contention about dehumanization because they're advocating for something that's much more dehumanizing and essentially much more worth. Their second contention talks about arbitrarity. They claim of how both sides have conceded about racism and essentially how racism is a desperate and dire problem. But what they're advocating for is doing something much worse, as opposed to punishing these citizens regularly using normal measures. As opposed to African Americans be sentenced 10 years according to the regular measures, or only a 2-year margin between that of average white people. What's happening is we're using cruel and unusual punishments. These cruel and unusual punishments will cause African Americans to be sentenced 10, 15, or 20 years more than that of the other counterparts. This actually exacerbates to racism, exacerbates dehumanization, and ultimately exacerbates human dignity. This increases racism by their plan because cruel and punishment invalues and actually exacerbates the punishment, and because of that, we must negate. Their third contention talks about rehabilitation. Throughout the course of today's debate, they claim this common fact about how the status quo, essentially rehabilitation, is the only thing that is essentially a form of dehumanization. But what we have to understand is, if we think about this logically, just take a step back. Is rehabilitation essentially cruel and unusual? If common people take a look and probabilize this resolution, would they interpret rehabilitation as cruel and unusual, or would they interpret it as that of essentially a fair punishment that is going on within the United States? And when taking a look at this probability example, which is the most prevalent example in terms of parliamentary debate, we realize that rehabilitation is essentially not cruel and unusual. And because it's not cruel and unusual, it simply shouldn't be on their flow. It should be on our flow and a reason to vote for the affirmative team. Now with this in mind, or vote for the negation team. Now with this in mind, let's address our contention. Our three contentions throughout the course of today's debate were left unrefuted. And because they were left unrefuted, essentially the government team has essentially dropped every single one of our contentions. I'll just link out and flesh out the great impacts of our plan. Contention 1 is that of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation essentially causes recidivism rates of 71%, or reduces it to 71%. What this means is people are less prone, less likely to recommit this crime. An extreme example is that of Caron Butler, a renowned NBA basketball player who at the age of 16 was addicted to cocaine. But because he was put through a usual punishment, that of rehabilitation, he was capable of turning his life around. He found his passion in basketball and he was given another chance. This should be what we as the United States thrive for. This rehabilitation point is already a vote for the negation. Our second contention talks about deterrence. Simply put, deterrence is cruel and unusual. By oftentimes punishing people much more than what they regularly would have been punished, or unnecessary punishment, people are oftentimes going to react violently. This was best represented by my partner's evidence within that of Texas, where when they instituted the death penalty, crime rates and death penalties actually went up. This was best exemplified in another example, which is that of Chicago. What happened in Chicago was that because we increased the amount of punishment, there was an increased amount of violence, up to 13% between gangs and that of police, because simply put, these gang members did not want to get caught. This deterrence caused this essential dehumanization, and this is a huge impact and a huge reason to vote for the negation. Now, in retrospect, we can see that another reason why deterrence doesn't work is because, simply put, people don't know what the value or what the punishment is. When people don't know what the punishment is, we can't simply hold them responsible for this punishment, allowing this deterrence point to flow across the board and be a huge reason why we must vote for the negation. Our third and final contention talks about Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is one of the extremist forms of cruel and unusual punishment. Men and women are searched within or have their cavities searched and oftentimes are sexually, mentally, and physically abused to the extremes. This is a huge detriment because it actually undermines the United States national security. In fact, Air Officer Matthew Alexander wrote in his book that essentially, because as long as Guantanamo Bay stays open, the cost will be a United States citizens' lives. What happens is terrorist organizations within that of the Middle East have an extremely high propaganda. For instance, the Taliban has this thing called the Emirate, and the Emirate essentially tells everything that the United States is doing wrong. And the major piece of propaganda is that of Guantanamo Bay, where they tell young men and women about the atrocious stories within Guantanamo. This cruel and unusual punishment fans the flame of terrorism. It increases anti-American sentiment, and terrorist organizations are harping upon it over and over again. This ultimately causes Guantanamo Bay to essentially fuel terrorism. Now, as the words of CIA head director John Brennan put it, Guantanamo Bay essentially undermines our national security. And with our national security at stake, the biggest net impact and the biggest net benefit in today's round, we stand in the strongest negation. Thank you.
Judges ready? Opponents ready? Again, we look at today's resolution, where the resolved punishment by its very nature should be somewhat cruel and unusual. Now, I'm going to address topicality really quick just because it's a voting issue. And the main point is that primarily the government team dropped the main point of the topicality in their first refutation speech to this. And that was that they had no refutation to victims and families that are affected by individuals in the justice system. Throughout the world, if you are being tried for a crime, it's not only you being affected, it's everybody you're related to.
Order.
Yes?
Of the time. Would you address your point, please, to the judge?
Yeah, so the second speaker basically stands up here and says a completely different narrative from what the first speaker is saying right now. The first speaker's he's shadow extending everything he said about families and stuff, but the second speaker clearly dropped all of that, which means it's now new.
Start the time.
Start? Okay.
Start the time, on time.
I actually said this in my very first speech, in the Leader of Opposition speech, that specifically victims and families are affected by the crime just as much as the people directly involved. It's not only the individuals directly involved with the crime that take the punishment, but it's everybody involved that sees what happens. And this is what they dropped in their own speech. And as a result, this is one reason to vote for the opposition team, that they completely dropped this point. And they tried to reverse voter issue it. But in actuality, this topicality, that the more education in this round, the more exposure we have to different types of debate. Moving on, we're going to look at the three main voter issues for today's debate. First is rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is the brand new opportunity, the second chance for individuals caught for a crime that can now have a new chance at life. Now, the government team comes up here and tries to say that rehabilitation is actually a point for them. But let's observe their definitions that we agree to. They say, first, it cannot be arbitrary. Now, rehabilitation is for a reason. It's because you did something wrong, so it's not arbitrary. They cannot be unnecessary or too extreme. Now, as I said before, which they have not refuted, rehabilitation is not the extreme choice. You're not ending their life. You're not incarcerating them in a supermax prison. You're not doing anything. What you're doing is you're telling them what they did is wrong, why you're fixing their problems. The next part is it can't be degrading. It's not degrading because individuals support. It makes you more humane in the future because people who commit less crimes are considered more human. It's not humane. In addition to this, the last point was, it's not that it would be rejected by society, but in fact, rehabilitation is not rejected by society because individuals are supported to go through rehabilitation if they're on drugs, commit a crime, or other things such as this. Rehabilitation can only go for the opposition team because it does not fit their definition of cruel and unusual punishment. As a result, they cannot claim this impact, any advantage of this, because it does not fit their own definitions. Now, looking forward, we observe how this gives you a second chance, more humane. They did not refute this contention at all on the opposition team's case. And because of this, we observe less dehumanization through prisons and other forms of cruel and unusual punishments, which means that these individuals going through rehabilitation are going to have a better chance at life. Instead of living their entire life in a prison without a second chance at reintegrating themselves into society, they're going to be more humane. This is not going to be, under the government team's definition for cruel and unusual punishment, what they want to do is imprison these guys to make them go through this unusual punishment. That's also very cruel. And because of this, that is much more dehumanizing and less putting of a human than this is as rehabilitation. That's one voting issue and one impact you're going to vote for the opposition team. The second contention we talked about is deterrence and how the death penalty in Texas and North Dakota actually showed an increase in homicide rates in these respective states the 5 years after they were enacted, which means specifically cruel and unusual punishment, the death penalty. They never refuted how the death penalty was or was not cruel and unusual punishment. We said that it is. They did not refute this. Flow this across the board, and as such, we observe that there is a clear link between cruel and unusual punishment, increasing deaths and increasing harm in the future. As a result, we're going to look at this as a major voting issue because we have death and dehumanization as two separate voting issues in today's debate. If you don't even believe this, we have a third voting issue, which is of racism. They said in their own speech that they advocate for racism because they allow cruel and unusual punishment, which has a system of increasing racism in the future to take place. As a result, they're increasing racism by having cruel and unusual punishment in place at all. They also did not refute this point, the third point about racism overall. The fourth point talked about Guantanamo Bay. They talked about how laws in the United States, or the Bill of Rights, specifically does not allow this. The problem is that the Guantanamo Bay is not in the domestic United States. It's in Cuba, which means that the laws in the United States does not apply here, which is the problem. It's cruel and unusual, not in the United States, not held by domestic United States laws, American laws, which means that this is why it's cruel and unusual, and as a result, we've seen increases in terrorism as a direct result, giving a bigger risk to our soldiers in the Middle East, hurting our chances of winning the wars, and as a result, we are hurting the United States as a whole. So because of these voter issues, because we outweigh on every stance, that we are making them more humane, decreasing deaths, making them more human, and decreasing racism, I strongly urge a vote for the opposition team. Thank you.
Opponents ready? Opponents ready? Yeah. Judges ready? All right. There's three voting issues as to why you should vote affirmative in today's debate. Our first voting issue is going to be about their theory shell. First of all, reverse everything they say about the theory shell because they completely shift their advocacy. In the first speech, they only talk about societal welfare, but in the second speech, the second speaker labels their new advocacy as net benefits. This is a moving target, and it completely changes the entire scope of the debate. When we talk about theory in terms of an educational perspective, when we talk about this in terms of fairness, don't let them change halfway through the entire round because that means a shifting advocacy. Furthermore, they concede that justice has nothing bad, but it could be better. And this is something that we admit as well. Justice wasn't the best standard that we could have possibly brought to this round, but they also concede the fact that my partner stated, as long as our value makes this debate round debatable, then it should be present because it is reasonable. And as long as something is reasonable, it means the debate will be educational, and that's what they fail to realize. Justice is reasonable. Their only response here is that everyone needs to be involved, but there's no standard here. When you have a violation, you need a standard to interpret it. They talk about breadth, but we say that breadth of education is actually bad. We say that anything about breadth is very superficial, and you can simply learn it by watching the news. But in a debate round uniquely, we can analyze issues very specifically, and we can focus specifically on the concrete nature of justice. And that's why we believe that depth is ultimately better than breadth. Furthermore, ground isn't skewed. Don't evaluate that portion of the standard as well. Our arguments are basically the same anyway, so there was no real ground skew since we are arguing for the same thing, and I'll be talking about later. Furthermore, evaluate our topicality shell first because we actually have voters. Vote for us because we're more educational. Vote for us because they abuse us by creating this entire moving target. Vote for us because they create a time skew with the theory shell. Our second voting issue is going to be about the framework and what actually this debate is about. It's very important to make very, very clear that our case doesn't change the constitutionality of cruel and unusual punishments. The entire topic is not called cruel and unusual punishment is good. The topic is not cruel and unusual punishment should be constitutional. The topic is punishment should be at least somewhat cruel and unusual. And that means what the framers wanted us to talk about is that punishment in general will always be cruel and unusual. And if it's always cruel and unusual, it means it's not constitutional. We aren't advocating for the absolving of the education system or the taxes. We're saying that these things are cruel and unusual, but every side agrees that when we talk about punishment, it has to be in response to a crime. Not only does it have to be cruel and unusual, it also has to be a punishment. That's what my partner's saying. Education is cruel and unusual, but it's not a punishment, and it's very non-topical, and it's strange that they bring up this entire anarchy point and they kind of spin this out of control. At the end of the day, the third voting issue is going to be about who achieves rehabilitation the best. Let's clarify the debate. The entire debate is about the fact that we don't change the constitutionality of cruel and unusual punishments. We're saying that every single punishment should be defined as cruel and unusual because it takes away from your fundamental right to make decisions for yourself after a punishment. That's the distinction we're making here. We're saying that they're bringing this example about the fact that it's retribution and it's not punishment, but retribution is punishment. Retribution takes away your own right to autonomy. They're basically saying that people who speed along the freeway don't deserve to have the same amount of money as people who actually follow the driving laws. That's the exact point they're making, and while that might make sense in some circles, when we're talking about justice specifically, it takes away your individual right to choose. The government shouldn't take away your money simply because you wanted to drive fast. And when we're talking about the value of justice, what ultimately matters in the end is not the net benefits they keep trying to skew this debate to, but the value round that we're trying to have in parliamentary debate. They concede that rehabilitation is not cruel and unusual, therefore it isn't a punishment. And therefore rehabilitation is the alternative to punishment punishment and retribution. We're saying that in the status quo, which is what they argue for, there is no rehabilitation. Well, there is some rehabilitation, but rehabilitation is not happening because punishment is simply the easier choice. Retribution is the easier choice, and even if both worlds have rehabilitation, we have more rehabilitation because every single instance of a fine, every single instance of an incarceration or a capital punishment is replaced with rehabilitation. In the end of the day, under both values, we achieve the most amount of benefits because all the impacts out of today's debate come from rehabilitation. All of their points about dehumanization, all of their points about justice, all of their points about net benefits and societal welfare, that's what we're talking about, but we achieve rehabilitation better, we have more rehabilitation, and therefore, since that's the only impact that matters within today's debate, we are the only ones uniquely capable of achieving rehabilitation because my opponents simply choose to accept the status quo where we accept that incarceration is racist, and they accept the status quo where we accept the entire idea that punishment is okay even though it takes away your individual right to choose. They concede punishment is bad, but they don't do anything to try to stop it. The affirmative is the only one in this entire debate trying to stop the injustice of punishment, and that's why for the three voting issues, I urge for a firm vote in the affirmative. Thank you.
Great debate, guys.
Good debate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Debate, Joseph.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Judge.